Now imagine a man so massive it looked like he didn't belong on this planet. That's not an exaggeration, we're talking about a physique that simply didn't make sense by human standards. When Greg Kovacs showed up, it wasn't just presence, it was impact. The kind of athlete that made people stop and think, how far can the human body really go? Standing around 6 feet 4 inches, 1.93 meters, and reaching an unbelievable 419 pounds, roughly 190 kilograms, Greg wasn't just big, he was massive on a level that almost felt unreal. His muscles didn't just fill space, they completely dominated it. It was like looking at a mountain of flesh and power, something that seemed to push beyond the natural limits of the human body. And that's exactly where the fascination begins. Because when someone reaches that level of size, expectations come automatically. Fans, experts, and even other athletes started to look at Greg as something more than just another competitor. Many believed he could redefine the sport, that he might even rival legendary names like Ronnie Coleman and Arnold Schwarzenegger. But here's where things take a different turn. Because when you look at someone with that kind of genetics, dedication, and sheer size, the next step seems obvious: dominate the sport. Except in Greg's case, things didn't go the way everyone expected. And that's what makes this story even more intriguing. So here's the question that drives everything: how does someone with that much potential, with a physique that extreme, not become the greatest of all time? What really happened to the man known as the Gentle Giant? That's exactly what you're about to find out. So make sure to like the video and let's get into it. Before becoming the giant who seemed to defy logic, Greg Kovacs had a much more ordinary beginning than most people would expect. He was born in 1968, in Canada, and grew up in a stable environment with strong family support. At that point, nothing suggested he would become one of the most extreme figures in bodybuilding history. But like many great stories, it all started simple. From an early age, Greg showed a strong interest in sports. Like a true Canadian, he was especially involved in hockey, along with soccer. And he wasn't just playing casually, he took it seriously. He trained, competed, and even played in junior leagues, showing discipline and commitment. At that time, it looked like his future could very well be on the ice. But there was something different about him, something that was starting to stand out. Even at a young age, Greg was already showing signs of unusual genetics. His body responded to training at an accelerated rate, building muscle mass with a level of ease that wasn't normal. What took others years seemed to happen to him in a fraction of the time. And that detail would completely change the course of his life. As the years went by, his interest in weight training kept growing. What started as something to improve his performance in sports quickly became his main focus. Greg began to realize he had a unique potential, something that could take him far beyond the field or the rink. And that's when everything started to shift. The decision became clear: leave hockey behind and fully commit to bodybuilding. From the moment Greg Kovacs decided to focus on bodybuilding, everything changed. Even during high school, he was already showing a level of dedication that stood out. While most people trained for aesthetics or just as a hobby, Greg seemed to have a bigger purpose even if it wasn't fully defined yet. He spent hours in the gym, repeating movements, adjusting weights, and most importantly, building something that was starting to turn heads. And what made it even more impressive was the speed of his transformation. His body was evolving at a pace that was way beyond normal, almost unbelievable. Where others would take years to gain a few pounds of muscle, Greg was progressing exponentially. It was as if his genetics were always one step ahead, responding intensely to every stimulus. And that didn't go unnoticed, not by those training with him, and not by those just watching from a distance. Over time, that evolution created something inevitable: impact. Greg was no longer just the big guy at the gym. He was becoming a presence that couldn't be ignored. Wherever he went, people noticed. They stopped, stared, talked. His physique was crossing the line from impressive into extraordinary. And that's when something important happens: awareness. Not just from others, but from Greg himself. He starts to realize he's not just another athlete. He's different. There's something there that sets him apart. And that awareness begins to shape his decisions, his mindset, and most importantly, his ambition within the sport. It's also at this point that the identity that would follow him throughout his career begins to take shape: the giant. Not just because of his size, but because of how he carried himself within the world of bodybuilding. If Greg Kovacs was already turning heads up to that point, 1996 is when everything truly changed. That was the year he stopped being just a prospect and officially stepped into the professional bodybuilding scene. And it wasn't a quiet entrance, it was the kind that makes everyone stop and look twice. Earning his pro card wasn't even close. Greg didn't just win, he dominated the competition. This wasn't a balanced battle, it was a clear display of physical superiority. He didn't just beat his opponents, he overwhelmed them. The weight difference between him and second place was insane. We're talking about roughly 49 pounds more, around 22 kilograms. In bodybuilding, that's massive. It was like Greg was operating on a completely different level, something that challenged the very standards of the sport. And when you look at his physique numbers, it gets even more unreal. Arms measuring close to 26 inches, about 66 centimeters, a chest around 70 inches, roughly 178 centimeters, quads hitting the 35-inch range, about 89 centimeters. These weren't just big measurements, they were extreme, almost hard to believe even for longtime bodybuilding fans. That's when a powerful idea started gaining traction. Greg Kovacs wasn't just another promising athlete, he could be a revolution. After his explosive entry into the pro scene, Greg quickly became the center of attention in bodybuilding. He wasn't just another rising competitor, he was a phenomenon that sparked curiosity, admiration, and even a bit of unease. The entire community started watching his every move, trying to understand just how far this could go. And with that attention came something inevitable: debate. For the first time at that level, the sport found itself divided between two very clear philosophies. On one side, extreme size, represented by Greg. On the other, traditional aesthetics, built on symmetry, proportion, and conditioning. The comparisons came naturally. Names like Ronnie Coleman and Flex Wheeler were already dominating with physiques that balanced size and aesthetics almost perfectly. But Greg was different. He wasn't just part of the game, he looked like he was changing the rules. Could a physique that massive actually win under IFBB judging criteria? Because despite the visual impact, bodybuilding has always been judged on more than just size. There are clear standards, and Greg seemed to challenge all of them at once. That created a wave of expectation across the sport. Many believed he could force a shift, redefine what judges valued, and open the door to a new era. If 1996 was the explosion, then 1997 would be the moment of truth. The Night of Champions was Greg's first real test on the professional stage. Now it wasn't about potential anymore, it was about delivery. This was the moment he would finally stand side by side with established pros, and the entire world was watching. The hype was huge. A lot of people believed this could mark the beginning of a new era in bodybuilding. Seeing Greg next to the best in the world created real anticipation and even a bit of tension. But the moment he stepped on stage, something became clear almost instantly. Yes, the size was still there, maybe the most eye-catching of anyone. But this time, it wasn't enough to hide what was missing. For the first time, the flaws started to show. His symmetry wasn't at the level expected. His conditioning lagged behind compared to other competitors. And his proportions, that might have been the biggest issue. While others brought balanced, refined physiques, Greg looked out of sync, not because he was better, but because he didn't match what the judges were looking for. And that's when the narrative began to shift. That night marked the beginning of doubt. Could all that size really translate into wins? After the 1997 Night of Champions, Greg reached a turning point in his career. He had two clear paths: refine his physique aiming for better balance and detail, or push even further into what had already become his signature, extreme size. And right there, that's where the biggest mistake of his entire career began. Instead of fixing the flaws that had become obvious on stage, Greg chose a different path. He doubled down on the one thing that already had everyone in shock: sheer mass. The logic seemed simple: if I'm already the biggest, I'll become even bigger. With that shift in approach, balance started to take a back seat. The pursuit of proportion, aesthetics, and flow slowly faded away. The focus became almost entirely about increasing size, as if that alone would be enough to secure victories at the highest level. And that's where the problem truly began, a problem that would only grow over time. His symmetry started to slip even further. Muscle detail, which once helped highlight his physique, began to disappear under the overwhelming volume. And overall harmony, one of the core pillars of bodybuilding, was gradually compromised. Greg was still impressive, but far from complete. And this is where the story starts to take a very different turn. As time went on, the consequences of that decision became impossible to ignore. What once looked like a minor loss of refinement was now something much more noticeable. Greg's physique was changing in a way that didn't impress the same way anymore. In fact, it started to raise concerns. One of the clearest signs was the growth of his waistline. His midsection, once relatively controlled, began to expand visibly. On stage, this completely disrupted his aesthetic. That classic V-taper, one of the most valued traits in bodybuilding, was starting to disappear. And neither judges nor fans missed it. Behind all of this was an extreme strategy. To sustain that massive size, Greg was reportedly consuming around 13,000 calories a day. That's an enormous amount of food, designed to fuel a body operating far beyond normal limits. Proportion continued to fade. Posing, which should highlight strengths, began to expose his weaknesses even more. Clear signs of what the bodybuilding world often refers to as Palumboism started to appear, that distended, blocky midsection that throws off the entire look. The visual impact wasn't the same anymore. Now there was an imbalance that was hard to ignore. But the effects of that extreme size didn't stay on stage, they started spilling into Greg's everyday life in very real ways. What looked impressive to the audience became a constant challenge in practice. And this is where the story becomes even more striking. Simple daily activities started to become difficult. Things most people do without thinking, sitting comfortably, moving with ease, even standing still for long periods, now required effort. Greg's body, built to be massive, was no longer functioning efficiently. Another detail that stands out is his constant need to cool down. Greg would sweat excessively, even at rest. The amount of heat generated by his massive body was so intense that he started carrying a portable fan almost everywhere he went. Restaurants, events, travel, it became part of his routine. And over time, the limitations became even more obvious. The size that once symbolized power began to create real physical barriers. Basic movements became exhausting, and his body seemed to be under constant strain. If the warning signs were already clear off stage, on stage they became impossible to ignore. Bodybuilding is a sport of direct comparison, and when Greg stepped back under the lights, he was now being placed side by side with athletes who represented exactly what he had moved away from: balance, aesthetics, and refinement. The 2004 Arnold Classic became one of the most symbolic moments of that decline. Greg finished in 16th place, a result far removed from what was once expected of someone who had been seen as a potential revolution in the sport. And more than just the placing, it was the way he showed up that really caught attention. The issues were undeniable. His distended midsection completely broke the flow of his physique. His conditioning was no longer on par with the other competitors. And the overall imbalance, especially between his upper body and legs, made it clear that things were slipping out of control. The visual impact was still there, but it was no longer the kind of impact that wins championships. Then came the 2005 Toronto Pro, which essentially closed that chapter. Greg didn't even crack the top 16. After a series of results drifting further and further from the top, reality became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a bad phase anymore, it was a clear sign that something wasn't working. Slowly, the hardest realization set in: he couldn't adapt. Bodybuilding was evolving, judging standards were becoming more refined, and the athletes dominating the stage were those who could balance size with aesthetics. Greg, on the other hand, had gone down a path that pulled him away from that balance. And at that point, turning things around was no longer simple. That's when the decision came. Without big announcements or dramatic farewells, Greg began stepping away from competition. It was the end of a journey that started with massive expectations, but ended quietly. Over time, his legacy began to shift. The athlete once seen as a potential revolution was now remembered differently. Not as the man who would change the sport, but as an example of what can happen when you push an extreme too far. Even after stepping away from competition, Greg didn't disappear from the bodybuilding world. In fact, he tried to find a new place within the sport that had shaped his identity. Because when you've spent years living something that intense, walking away completely isn't that easy. One of the ways he stayed involved was through coaching. Greg began sharing his experience with other athletes, guiding training, strategy, and contest prep. Despite the mistakes that marked his career, there was still a deep well of knowledge there and that drew interest from those who wanted to learn from someone who had lived the extremes of the sport. He also started appearing at expos, events, and seminars around the world. His presence still turned heads, and his story, full of highs and lows, became a point of fascination. He wasn't just another former athlete, he represented a unique chapter in bodybuilding history. Greg also got involved in the supplement industry, helping promote products and keeping his image tied to the fitness world. It was a way to stay connected to the audience while building a new source of income outside of competition, a path many athletes eventually take. As the years went by, the signs that something wasn't right became more and more evident. What once felt like a distant concern was now becoming reality. The body that once seemed indestructible was starting to show the cost of everything it had been pushed through. In 2008, one of the first major warnings came. During a workout, Greg suddenly passed out while performing a bench press. The situation was serious enough that he had to be rushed to the hospital. This was no longer just fatigue or wear and tear, it was a clear sign that his health was compromised. But the issues didn't stop at his physical condition. In 2010, Greg became involved in a scandal that further damaged his image. He was accused of extortion involving a supplement store owner, which led to a brief time in jail. For someone who had already faced a decline in the sport, this added another layer of impact, now on a personal level. While all of this was happening, his health continued to deteriorate. Years of extreme choices in training, diet, and lifestyle were starting to take a serious toll. And then comes the hardest moment of this story. After years of pushing his body to the absolute limit, Greg Kovacs would face the ultimate consequence. On November 22, 2013, the bodybuilding world received the news no one wanted to hear. At just 44 years old, the giant was gone. The official cause of death was linked to heart-related complications, something that, for many, unfortunately didn't come as a complete surprise. When a body is pushed under extreme stress for years, especially with that level of size, weight, and physical demand, the heart is often one of the first systems to feel the impact. And it's important to understand, this doesn't happen overnight. It wasn't a single event, it was the result of years of accumulated strain on the body. Intense training, extreme eating, aggressive cycles, and a lifestyle taken to the absolute limit. Over time, all of that builds a kind of silent wear and tear. Greg's passing wasn't just the loss of an athlete. It was a shock to the entire bodybuilding community. A reminder that behind the muscle, there's still a human body with real limits. And often, those limits only become visible when it's already too late. When Greg Kovacs' story is looked at today, it carries far more weight than just numbers or titles. He became a symbol of extremes in bodybuilding. A clear example of how far the human body can go, but also how far it maybe shouldn't. In many ways, Greg represents a duality within the sport. On one side, massive potential, something rare, almost one of a kind. On the other, a series of decisions that pulled him away from the top. And it's exactly that contrast that keeps his story alive in conversations to this day. Because it's not simple, it's layered, complex, and full of contradictions. The biggest lesson is clear, and maybe one of the most important in bodybuilding: size without balance doesn't win. No matter how impressive the mass is, without symmetry, proportion, and conditioning, a physique won't hold up at the highest level. And Greg, in many ways, became the ultimate example of that truth. Even today, his name still comes up in debates, videos, and discussions. Anytime the topic is extremes in bodybuilding, Greg Kovacs is part of the conversation. He may not have been the greatest champion, but in a way, he became unforgettable. And that says a lot about the impact he had, even without winning the titles many expected. And that brings us to the final question: what if? What if Greg had adjusted his strategy? What if he had focused more on balance, corrected his weaknesses, and adapted his physique to the standards of the sport? Could we be talking about one of the greatest of all time? That's a question we'll never truly answer. But one thing is certain, his story lives on because of those very questions. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think Greg Kovacs could have become a Mr. Olympia? Or was his path always meant to unfold this way? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this debate is far from over.